Hello everybody and welcome to this pre-recording of the anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract. I am Tanya Chamberlain and I am from the Division of Anatomy here at the University of Leeds. You can reach me at any point at this email address here, that's t.n.chamberlain@leeds.ac.uk. If you have any questions about today's pre-recorded lecture or any anatomy questions that will help you in your dentistry, you can reach me there. But as discussed, today we are going to be looking at the anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract. So let's have a look at the objectives that we are going to be covering. And by the end of this lecture and any further necessary study, so that's any self-directed study you might need, you should be able to outline the components of the digestive system, that's from proximal to distal, and describe their main functions. You should also be able to describe what we mean by the term the peritoneal cavity. So that's describe the action or describe the locations of the peritoneal cavity and describe what we mean when we talk about the peritoneal cavity. And lastly, you should be able to describe the regions of the abdominal cavity. So as we move on to our next slide, let's have a look at the functions of the digestive tract. The digestive tract assists in the transportation of foodstuffs, and it also assists in the breakdown of foodstuffs. So when we put things in our mouth, when we put food or water in our mouths, our body requires it to be broken down into transportable goods. And it does this by a variety of methods. Some of these are mechanical digestion, for which is simply the breaking down of food. And some of this is in the form of chemical digestion. So this refers to things like the act of enzymes degrading the foodstuff into molecular-sized chunks. So that is things like sugars, proteins, fats, vitamins and minerals, and of course water. Our body needs these from the outside world and it needs to be able to absorb them. So most of this absorption happens within the small intestine. Some of it will happen within the large intestine, but we will come on to that in a little while. But at the end of this digestive process, we also produce waste goods. So stuff that our body doesn't need, stuff that may be potentially harmful to our body, or the fibre in which is passed, it helps the passage of the food into through the digestive tract. And so at the end of our journey, the digestive tract is responsible for the excretion of waste material. So as we have a overview of the digestive tract, so this may be referred to as the GI tract, or it can be referred to as the gastrointestinal tract. So if we think about how our bodies are built, we have one long continuous tube that runs from our mouth to our anus. Essentially, we are built around this tube. And so we can think of ourselves as a giant polo mint or donut, for which we have an opening at the beginning and an opening at the end and one long continuous tube between those openings. At various points, we have organs that empty secretions into the tract, which are required during digestion. So these may be enzymes, as briefly mentioned, in the process of chemical digestion. The enzymes break the foodstuffs into molecular-sized chunks in which we can absorb them within our bloodstream. But we also have things like acid and bile, which we will look at in a little while. So as an overview of this digestive tract, we have two large groups of organs. We have the major subdivisions of the gastrointestinal tract, and these are organs or systems or cavities which are in direct contact with the foodstuff that we are consuming. So these are things like the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, and both the small and large intestines. And then we also have a series of organs, as discussed, some of which throw out chemicals, so acid or bile or enzymes, which aid with the digestion of food. And these handy little helpers are called the accessory organs. So the accessory organs of the gastrointestinal tract are the salivary glands, which of course release saliva. We also have the liver, we have the gallbladder, and we have the pancreas. There's also another gastrointestinal tract. There is also another organ of the abdomen, which we won't discuss today, but that is the spleen, and that's largely because it deals with the breakdown of red blood cells rather than used as a source for digestion. Okay, so let's move on and look at the tube itself. So we are going to look at the major subdivisions of the gastrointestinal tract first, and then after we've covered that, we will look at the accessory organs and their role that they play within digestion. So the tube. Now, embryologically, we develop in three parts when we're looking at the GI tract. So this picture here on the right is kind of an expanded, unwound, stretched out tube that's going to help us identify whereabouts these particular things fit within the journey, not necessarily within the abdomen. So the gut is divided into three parts, as I've already said. We have the foregut here, which ends at the duodenum, partway through the duodenum. And then we have the midgut, which is the rest of the small intestine and most of the large intestine. And then lastly, we have the hindgut, which is the remainder of the large intestine and the rectum. In terms of why we need to know fore, mid and hind, it's not something that you will be tested on from this lecture, but when we look at innervations to these areas and blood supply to these areas, we have three main branches. We have the celiac trunk, we have the superior mesenteric that feed the midgut with blood supply, and we have the inferior mesenteric, which deals with the hindgut. But again, do not worry about blood supply. That is not something that you need to be fluent in for your role as dentists. But what you do need to be fluent in is the anatomical terminology in which we are going to use. And what we do is we describe the tube from a proximal to distal end. So the proximal end of that gut tube would be the oral cavity. So imagine the oral cavity sitting up here. And then slightly more distal to the oral cavity, so we're moving distally here. We have the next passage, which is the esophagus, and we can just see this poking behind the liver here and entering the stomach, which is the next organ on our list of the major subdivisions. So food starts in the oral cavity, it then enters the esophagus, then it enters the stomach, Then it enters the small intestine, the large intestine, and finally the rectum before it exits through the anus. So let's have a look at the first stop. Let's break down the oral cavity further and look at what happens there. So the anatomy of the oral cavity you should be fairly comfortable with. If you need a recap on the oral cavity at all, you can look at your notes from 1128, that's the intro to the oral cavity, where it was reflected on largely with anatomy, but you shouldn't need that much anatomy for that much anatomy of the oral cavity in order to understand the GI tract for the rest of this lecture. Okay, so what happens in the oral cavity? Well, the oral cavity is the beginnings of digestion. So we have mechanical digestion happening within the oral cavity. And this is largely just the chomping of food. So we have our tongue, which helps to push the food around the oral cavity and ensure that it is completely spread amongst the teeth, and the teeth will then mechanically break that giant bite that you have made of that bagel and begin to chomp on it into smaller parts. So we have action of the tongue and we have action of the teeth breaking up the food particles. But we also have chemical breakdown of food. So that begins from the salivary glands. So we have the parotid, we have the submandibular, and we have the sublingual salivary glands. And these release enzymes within the saliva. Particularly, they release amylase. So amylase is important for the digestion of carbohydrates. Amylase is released into the mouth, which also begins acting on that bagel that you have put in your mouth and breaking it down. So you'll notice that even if you eat bread with no sugar ingredients, that if you eat dry bread for long enough, you will notice that it starts to taste sweet. And that is the action of the amylase. Saliva is also very important for lubricating the food. You will know if you have a dry mouth and you try swallowing, it is very difficult. So saliva acts to lubricate the food for its passage into the pharynx. So the muscles of the tongue, we only have one, the muscles of the tongue, we have lots of muscles, only one tongue, pushes the food backwards once it is of swallowing size, where it enters the pharynx, which is this section here. So we have the nasopharynx, which is the place between the nasal cavity and the mouth, and we have the oropharynx, where we have the three constrictor muscles. If you need a brush up on your anatomy, don't forget to look back at 1128, which contract and push the food into the esophagus. Now, the larynx also plays a role here, although it is not part of the GI tract. But when we swallow, our larynx is lifted by the muscles attached between the hyoid and the larynx. And the epiglottis closes off to ensure that our airways are protected. So that food has entered the esophagus behind the larynx, where it will continue. But we can have clues about our GI tract or from systemic disease when we look inside our oral cavity. So we can see decay, we can see ulceration of the mouth, abscesses, softened teeth erosion, discoloration of teeth or oral thrush. All of these may be indicative of GI tract issues or systemic disease. So things like oral thrush can be an indicator of diabetes. We can have, I should clear up that when we look on at the pancreas in more details, one of the accessory organs, we look at the pancreas. Pancreas is an exocrine and an endocrine gland, and one of the functions is in the role of insulin secretion. So we can potentially see a fault that is happening within the pancreas inside the oral cavity when we look at oral thrush. Teeth erosion can be indicative of an esophageal hiatus. So we can have the functioning of the sphincters that stop acid coming up into the esophagus can be faulty, in which case we can have excess acid, which can cause softening the teeth or erosion. Decay, again, can also be a symptom of both of these. We can also look at more systemic disease or the biopsychosocial factors of medicine and dentistry, where we can see other things that are playing a part in these decay, ulceration, abscesses, etc. So after the food has exited the pharynx and moved into the esophagus, we can have a look at the esophagus and how it works. So the esophagus is a muscular tube which connects the mouth to the stomach. It is present in the thorax and travels down the back of the trachea and behind the heart. So this muscular tube consists of smooth muscle. So this is muscle that we do not have conscious control of. So it is innervated by our autonomic nervous system. We don't have any ability to push food down, any conscious ability to push food down. But these circular muscles constrict behind the bolus of food. So the food is now called a bolus. And push it through the esophagus until it enters the stomach. Now, as we said, the esophagus is travelling between the mouth and the abdomen at this point, so it's within the thorax, and it pierces the diaphragm at the level of the thoracic vertebrae T10. Now, when we reach the stomach, we can see here we have a picture of a stomach, and we can see that this is where the esophagus would lie. And at the bottom of that esophagus, we have an esophageal sphincter. And this esophageal sphincter is a ring of muscle that controls the influx of food entering the stomach and also closes to prevent acid coming back up the esophagus. As the food enters the stomach, so this stomach is a J-shaped bag, so it looks a little bit like a J. It is bashed about and thrown about mechanically, so this is through a series of contractions that physically break the bolus into a liquid. So it churns the bolus up, moving it from a solid to a liquid. And the liquid that is within the stomach is very acidic. So this is hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And it's secreted by the cells that line these rugae. So these rugae are muscular ridges within the stomach, and we have a series of secreting cells within these rugae. And these secreting cells not only act to produce hydrochloric acid, but they also act to provide the walls of the stomach with a thick mucus that prevents the acid burning through the stomach and into the abdomen itself. So this acid works by, so the pH of the stomach acid is about 1.5 to 2.5. And it has two major components, two major uses, sorry. And those are for the destruction of any bacteria, any harmful bacteria that we may ingest. But the acid also turns on the enzymes that provide chemical digestion to the food. So the enzymes are kicked into the stomach, and these work in an environment which is highly acidic, because these enzymes are turned on, are activated by the high acidic concentration within the stomach. So the stomach itself, we have 4 regions of the stomach. So we have the fundus, which is everything above here. So all of this would be considered the fundus of the stomach. Then we have the body of the stomach, which is the majority of the stomach is considered the body. We have the antrum towards the end. And then we have another sphincter at the end called the pylorus. And this pylorus controls the outlet of the chyme. So this soupy mess is now called a chyme. Controls the exit of the chyme into the small intestine, which we can see labelled here. So as we exit the stomach through the pylorus, through the pyloric sphincter, we enter the small intestine. Now we have 3 regions to the small intestine. We have the duodenum, which is the first part in which the chyme will enter. Then we have the jejunum, which is the middle part of the small intestine. And finally, we have the ileum, which is the small intestine just before we get to the large intestine. Now, largely what is happening within the small intestine is the nutrient absorption. So the vitamins and minerals and the proteins and the fats are largely absorbed by the small intestine. Small interesting fact that I particularly love is the amount of films that get this wrong. So what we have attaching our intestine to the back wall, so the posterior wall of the abdomen, is this mesentery. So we can see here, like this kind of tissuey, sort of fascia-y kind of material that attaches the intestine to the back wall. And a lot of films tend to get this wrong. They assume that when we cut somebody open, if we tip them upside down, all their intestines would unwind like string of spaghetti, and fall out of the body. This will not happen. So we have this mesentery that is stopping this happening. So whenever you've seen a film with a stab wound, where somebody's walking around with piles and piles of unlooped intestine, that would not actually happen because of this mesentery. And this mesentery is formed from peritoneum, which we'll discuss later on in the lecture. But next time you see that in a film or in a TV program, do think of me when you do so. So let's break it down. So we have the small intestine. We have the duodenum, which is the first part, followed by the jejunum, and then finally the ileum. Now the duodenum is the first 10 to 15 centimetres or so of intestine, and it's C-shaped. So the stomach is sitting here. This is the end of the stomach, so this is where we would find the pylorus, and then this C-shaped intestine here is the duodenum. Now, the duodenum has a couple of openings in it in the wall here, and this is where the pancreas would sit. So the pancreas is secreting enzymes into the duodenum, and we also have another tube, a very small thin vessel, which comes down And this small duct is called the bile duct, and that comes from the gallbladder. And that secretes into the duodenum bile. So the gallbladder produces bile. And we have enzymes that are being secreted into the duodenum from the pancreas, which is sitting here. This bile acts to neutralize the acid, so to protect the rest of the intestines from the harmful effects of an acidic environment. And it also acts to activate the enzymes which are being released by the pancreas. So our food is currently sat here. It is met by this soupy mess of enzymes and bile, and the food, the chyme begins to make its way through the duodenum, where it enters the jejunum. So this jejunum is represented, and I can only apologise, I don't know why whoever created this decided to put red and green together, but this first half of the small intestine after the duodenum is the jejunum, and then this large portion underneath where I'm highlighting now is ileum. So the jejunum and the ileum they have ring-like ridges around the inside. And so the inner surface has been highly folded into villi. Now, villi act to increase the surface area, so increase the rate of absorption. And they also aid with the stretching and the contraction, pushing the food along. So these villi are also increased by, the surface area is also increased by the cells of the villi, which are termed microvilli, that have finger-like projections that again are increasing the surface area and therefore making it easier to absorb nutrients across and into the walls, the cellular walls of the small intestine, where it can then be taken into the bloodstream for circulating to the liver for processing. So after we have gone through the duodenum, through the jejunum, and then through the ileum, we enter the large intestine down here. So this is where the food enters the large intestine. And the large intestine can sometimes be called the colon. So on our cadaveric image to the right, we have large intestine visible. So we have the cecum, which would be down here. And at the bottom of the cecum, that's where our appendix is located. And after the cecum, we have the ascending colon, where it then makes a 90-degree turn and becomes the transverse colon, where it makes another 90-degree turn, not visible on this image, where it becomes the descending colon and would travel down here. And then finally, we have an S-shaped section of colon, which is the sigmoid colon, which we can just see coming here. We cannot see the rectum, which is argued as being the last stop of the large intestine. Sometimes it's just called the rectum on its own merit and doesn't have anything to do, and people don't refer to it as being the final part of the large intestine, but for the sake of arguments, we will. And the rectum would be tucked kind of down here behind all of this small intestine. We cannot see the rectum on this. So the proximal end of the colon, so the proximal end of the large intestine, would be the cecum. So we have this junction between the large intestine and the small intestine, so the ileum. So this is called the ileocolic junction, where the food is being passed. Now on images, it's not very clear on this one, but when you see drawings, the large intestine is the one that is bubbled. So we tend to have bubbles like this, and these bubbles are called hostra. and they act to increase the surface area for water absorption. But they also help with the movement of food stuff, which is going to be largely waste at this point, or the goods kind of been absorbed in the small. And so the hostra act to help with the propelling of waste further down the pipe until it is evacuated. So the main functions of the large intestine are for water absorption and also the formation of fecal mass. So as water is absorbed into the large intestine and passed into the bloodstream, the food is compacted and forms circular poops, so fecal matter, as it is pushed along. It also secretes a selection of mucus, which enables the pushing of poop as it makes its way through our gastrointestinal tract, because we absorb so much of the water that it's quite dry and it would be incredibly difficult to push and probably very painful as well. So on the next image, we have a barium contrast. So this patient has swallowed a barium meal, which is a radioactive substance that allows us to track what is happening within the GI tract. So we can see on here all of this that is in bright white, including this part, although not as bright a white here, and I'll explain why in a second. This is the large intestine. So down in the right-hand side, so that's the patient's right-hand side, we would have the cecum down here, and the appendix is a little organ, like a little finger size projection that would come off the bottom of that. And we have the ascending colon, so this is this part moving up here, and then it makes a 90-degree right turn and becomes the transverse colon. Now the transverse colon is also suspended in a mesentery, just like the small intestine, but not the same mesentery, and so it's able to become highly mobile. So this is why it looks like it's kind of sagging in the middle here, and not like the lovely textbooks images that we see. That's because we have accounted for the mesentery, which is attaching it to the back wall, but allowed it to sag. At the end of the transverse colon, it takes another 90-degree turn and becomes the descending colon, which is this portion of the large intestine here. As we reach the bottom, we are reaching the sigmoid colon. So this sigmoid is down here, is down here, and it's making this giant S shape. Now we can see here that this isn't as bright as what it is, and that's because the sigmoid colon likes to fill up with gas. So what's happened here is the barium meal has kind of accumulated here and accumulated after, but the sigmoid also has a mesentery, so is highly mobile. And of course, when because gas is lighter than air, it has a tendency to distend and push the sigmoid up. So push the sigmoid superiorly, which is why it's quite large, quite inflated, and doesn't have a great deal of barium in. In images, sometimes the sigmoid is drawn down here. It's distended, which is why it's raised in this particular image. After the sigmoid, we have this vertical piece here. This vertical piece is the rectum. And at the very end of the rectum, we have the anal canal as where the food would exit the body. Let me just get our rectum label up. There we go. The rectum is this vertical piece. So think of erect, meaning upright. That's where we get our term rectum from. Okay, so that is the major subdivisions of the gastrointestinal tract. So now we're going to have a look at some of the accessory organs. And the first one we are going to look at is the pancreas. So the pancreas, as we discussed, is an accessory organ. And we said already that it sits within the duodenum. So this is the duodenum. This is the first part of the small intestine, as we mentioned when we were looking at the intestines themselves. So this is the duodenum, the C-shaped curve, and this is the pancreas, so this frilly organ in the middle. And this has a couple of large ducts. So we have this major duct down here, and then we have a small minor duct, both of which are opening into the duodenum. So all of the enzymes created within the pancreas are able to enter where the food is kept. We can also see that we had that bile duct, which we will look at more clearly, but that bile duct is also coming down and entering at the same points too. So the pancreas itself has 4 sections. It has a head, which is this part here. It has a neck, which is just the bit after the head. Then we have a body, and then finally we have this very small tail at the end. And the pancreas, we have already mentioned, is a gland, and it is an exocrine gland, so that means it's excreting it's excreting enzymes to be used outside of the bloodstream. So these will be used outside of the body, which is within the GI tract. So technically, we are, like I mentioned at the beginning, we are a hole. We are a shape with a hole all the way through. So it's an exocrine gland which secretes enzymes for digestion, but also it is an endocrine gland. So it's involved in the control of insulin and glucagon. So this is controlling our blood sugar levels through cells within the pancreas. So the next organ that we are going to look at is going to be the liver. So the liver sits high up within the rib cage. It sits within the abdominal cavity because it sits below the diaphragm, but it sits high up within the rib cage. And the liver has 4 lobes. When we are looking from the front, the liver we can see has a right lobe, which is where my mouse currently is, and it also has a left lobe. On this image over to the left, we are actually looking at the liver from the posterior aspect. So this is the right large lobe from here, and then this one is the left. So this one is pointing over here. So we're looking at it backwards. But anatomically, we have 2 more lobes as well. But these are, like I said, positioned on the posterior aspect. So quite frequently, we don't actually see these on diagrams. So we have the caudate liver, which is this small lobe here. And we have the quadrate liver, which is this one down here, that's shaped like a quadrangle, which is why it's called the quadrate lobe. Anatomically, all 4 of these lobes do exactly the same. Their blood supply is slightly different. And the reason why people are able to have partial liver, not replacements, transplants, apologies, is because the left and the right lobes have different blood supplies and different drainage. So we can take one off and it will still continue to work as normal afterwards. So the roles of the liver are to produce bile. So we talked about briefly that the gallbladder stores bile, but the liver produces the bile. It's also used to detox alcohol and paracetamol and all other kinds of drugs. It's like a giant filtration system for the blood of the body, for which we do not want all of those kind of dangerous chemicals floating around our body for too long. So it acts as a giant filter to prevent intoxication and eventually death. It also produces albumin, which is a protein of blood plasma. It also produces some clotting factors. So people with clotting disorders, the source of those disorders is normally the liver. And it also stores glycogen. So we briefly looked at the role of the pancreas with its glucagon and insulin involvement. So this is closely linked to the liver, because those sugars are stored in the liver, are broken down by the glucagon and the all required as by the body. Okay, so this liver is highly protected, enclosed in its space within the rib cage. But let's have a look at the gallbladder, which is the organ closely linked with the liver. We could see on here, but we're going to have a greater look now. So the gallbladder is a little pear-shaped sac, and this gallbladder stores the liver bile. So the liver creates the bile. It leaves through the common duct and exits into the cystic duct of the gallbladder, which is here, and then sits in the gallbladder until it is needed. The gallbladder also, because of the highly saltine concentration, we can have the bile salts accumulate in here and get gallstones. Gallstones can be treacherous little things and cause no end of problems and are very painful. But essentially they block this duct, which can cause problems further along the tract. So the role of bile is to increase the pH of the duodenum, because remember we've had all this stomach acid pass into the duodenum. So it increases it, it neutralizes this acid to a more friendly pH to prevent damage to the intestine. But it also acts to emulsify fat. So fat, as we know, is hydrophobic. So when you drop when you drop oil in water, they do not mix, they sit at the top. But this emulsification properties of bile acts a little bit like soap does, in that it helps to break down the big globules of fat, like in a lava lamp, into very small globules so that they can be absorbed by the intestine further along the tract. Fat, of course, is very important. There are certain vitamins that can only be absorbed through the fats within our body. So fat, very important for certain vitamins. Vitamin D is one of them. It's a hydrophobic vitamin and requires the absorption of fat. So therefore, the breakdown of fat by the bile within the duodenum is very important. We've had this common duct here. So this is where the bile is leaving the gallbladder through the common duct. So this is the bile duct. And the bile duct enters the duodenum. And we also have some blood vessels which are kind of coming up from this direction and entering the liver. And they together are known as the portal triad. So we have the bile duct, which is this one underneath my mouse right now. And then we have the artery. So we have the hepatic proper artery, or proper hepatic artery, which is blood supply to the liver. And then we have the hepatic portal vein. And the hepatic portal vein is blood that is being drained from the intestines and taken to the liver. So this is hepatic portal vein, is the one with all of the nutrients in. So the liver will process that. And together, these three structures are within a mesentery. And these structures are known as the portal triad. So this structure within the body is very important. But I've used this word a couple of times now. I've used the word mesentery a couple of times. But what is mesentery? What is peritoneum? What is the peritoneal cavity? Well, it's quite a difficult concept to explain in terms of the peritoneal cavity is a potential space. And what that means is it's not actually a space. So it's not like the abdominal cavity that we think of as being the place that houses organs. Okay, the peritoneum isn't like that. So what I've done is I've kind of come up with a simple balloon model which will hopefully explain what it is that I'm trying to say. So if we imagine that this is a balloon full of liquid. So this is the peritoneum and it's full of liquid. So in here we have all this peritoneal fluid. Okay, and this around the outside is peritoneum. And what this is just like a sheet of cells that forms all around our body cavity. And it's the wall of the balloon, let's say for argument's sake. The wall of the balloon is called the peritoneum. The space inside is called the peritoneal cavity, and that peritoneal cavity is full of peritoneal fluid. Now let's draw in a pretend organ. Okay, so let's just pretend that this is an organ. Let's pretend it's some intestine, okay? And we're only going to be able to look at this 2D at the minute, but I will use a different image in a little while, which will help explain that. So these organs aren't actually sat in the peritoneal cavity, but let's pretend that this balloon has an organ that is being pushed into it. Okay, so we're going to push this organ into the balloon, but not inside the balloon. Okay, so we can see what's happened here. We've got this wall, this balloon wall all around the outside, and then we've got the balloon wall that is wrapping itself around the organ. Okay, this is peritoneum. So our organ isn't in the liquid, but is surrounded by the liquid, the peritoneal liquid. And it's got like a wall of peritoneum directly in contact with the organ, and then we have a wall of peritoneum around the outside. Now this wall of peritoneum around the outside is what is lining the inside of our abdomen. So we have this all the way around our abdomen, and then we also have peritoneum that is wrapped all around our organs, but not all of them, and I'll come back to that again in a minute. And then, of course, we have this little space here. So this is a double-walled space because we have two layers of peritoneum really close together. And this is called a mesentery. So if we have a look here, I've coloured each different bit in a different colour. So we have peritoneum that is wrapped around the organ. This is called visceral peritoneum because we describe all of our organs as viscera. So this is visceral peritoneum in yellow. Then we have around the outside, still in blue, this is called parietal. This is parietal peritoneum because it goes around the perimeter. And then we have this little double wall here, this double wall part where we have two peritoneum very close together. And this is called a mesentery. And what this does is it allows for the passage of blood vessels and nerves and our lymph drainage, our lymphatic system to sit in here and drain the organ. Okay, so this is what's transporting our space. And this is called mesentery. But let's have a look on a more lifelike picture. So this is intestine in the middle, and we have our parietal peritoneum in blue all around the outside of our abdomen. So this is a cross section of the abdomen, a transverse section. So we've cut somebody in half and we're looking down into the hole. Okay, so we could imagine that their little feet are poking out here and their head would be above here somewhere. Okay, so this is the back with our spine, and these are our six-pack on the front and our obliques down the side. So this is some intestine, and we can see just around the outside we have the same yellowy orange visceral peritoneum around the outside of the organ. Then we have the parietal peritoneum, which is going across the whole of the abdomen wall, so over the back wall and over the front wall. And then we have our mesentery in the middle. So this is like the stalk in this case, which is suspending the intestine to the back wall to stop your intestines falling out in the event that somebody decides to cut you down the middle. Okay, so this is our transverse section, but what we're going to look at on this slide is our sagittal section. So this is a biological female because we can see a uterus here, we have a bladder here, we have the rectum here, and then we have the spine up the back. So we've cut somebody through the nose and through the pubic bone, and we're looking side on. So this would be our liver. Then we have some intestine, some more intestine, some more intestine, and eventually this would form into the rectum, where we would poop it out down at the bottom. So we have our parietal peritoneum, which is going throughout the whole of the abdominal cavity, sticking to the walls, the inside wall. And then we have our visceral peritoneum, which is the orange one that's in contact with each organ. Okay? And we have these stalks that are formed. So we have a mesentery here, which is formed between the liver and the stomach. So this is stomach, intestine. So this mesentery here would be called the lesser omentum. So this is this space here. And then we have another mesentery, which is formed between the stomach and the transverse colon. So the transverse intestine. And as we've said, this one is called the lesser omentum, and this one is therefore called the greater omentum. So this one hangs like a giant apron within the body. Obviously, this would not have this much fluid in it, but for the sake of simplicity, the peritoneal cavity looks much bigger than what it is. There is not normally anywhere near this much fluid in terms of scale. So what we have is we have three types of organs within the abdominal cavity. We have intraperitoneal organs, so these are organs that have visceral peritoneum all the way around. We have a stalk, so we have a mesentery, and then we have parietal peritoneum, which is anchoring it to the back wall of some description. But we also have retroperitoneal. So these are the ones that are just stuck to the back wall and only have the visceral peritoneum on the anterior side, so on the front, and then back to parietal peritoneum. Or we can have secondarily retroperitoneal. So these are ones that were developed in utero as retroperitoneal, but then they've stuck to the outside wall again. So they've stuck to the parietal wall. So they don't have a mesentery. And we've already looked at the lesser omentum. So this is the liver, and this is the stomach here. And we have that peritoneum that's stretching down the back wall, down between the two. So the inferior aspect of the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach. We have this sheet, this fabric, this fleshy sheet that's coming between the two. And this is called the lesser omentum. And we have a space behind that. So we have a hole that allows us to go between, we could stick our finger through that hole and we could see it through this lesser omentum. And we also have a greater omentum. So this is a cadaveric image of what it actually looks like when we open inside. So we have our lesser omentum here between our liver and our stomach. This is the lesser omentum, which we just looked at. Here's our gallbladder. But then we also have this giant apron-like structure, which hangs in front of the intestines. And so we can lift this up, and if we was to lift this up, we would see the intestines underneath. It is not stuck, it is very mobile. And what this actually does is it helps to isolate infection. So if we get abdominal infection, this will actually move to the infection site and enclose it until that infection has cleared up. So there's a lot of lymphatics within this omentum, the greater omentum, that will wrap itself around an infection. So if you've got appendicitis down here, so an inflamed appendix, you will see that this will all kind of move in this direction and wrap itself around until that infection is either cleared or surgically removed. So this is why we say that it kind of provides protection. In people with increased body mass, there will be more fat within here, not subcutaneous fat, but more visceral fat found within the greater omentum. And so that almost concludes what we're going to look at today, but we're just going to have a brief look at the surface anatomy, because people often think a lot of the abdominal organs are lower down than what they actually are. But in actual fact, they are quite higher up. So if we have a look at this image here, what we actually have are, we have divided a body into 9 regions. And this is what we do as anatomists and medics and anybody with kind of an interest in the abdominal region full stop, is we divide it up into 9 regions. And the uppermost region, like if we divide it into 3, so let's call this just sort of like band 1, is above this line here, and this line is at the bottom of the rib cage. So if we looked across the bottom of the rib cage, if you felt across the bottom of the rib cage and up, we would be looking at all of this that's happening upstairs. Okay, so we have the liver sitting up here, the stomach sitting up here. The spleen would also sit up here. The pancreas is up here. And then below that, between if you feel for your hip bone, the highest part of your pelvis, you would be feeling here. So between the bottom of your ribs and your pelvis, we have another section. And then we finally have our third section down here. But this is divided up into 9. So what we actually have, the level above this line and centrally is the epigastric region. So these are mid-clavicular lines down either side. So if you feel for your clavicle, you're looking for halfway between the points of the beginning and the end of the clavicle, your mid-clavicular line. And this is known as the epigastric region. So this is largely where we would find the stomach, most of the liver, the pancreas, maybe a small portion of the spleen would also be found in here. The duodenum, etc. And then below that, we would have the umbilical region. So our umbilicus would actually be sat here. And this is known as the umbilical region. So this is largely just intestine. So we'll have some transverse colon here. We'll have some small intestine also in there. And because we have an epigastric, so this is above gastric, we must also have a hypogastric. And this is everything from those high points of the hip and below within the midclavicular line down to the sort of the bony pubis of the pelvis. And this is largely, again, just small intestine. Now the sides are divided into left and right. So this would be right because we think about the patient's right, not about the observer's right. And we have one on either side. So we have a right hypochondriac area here. we have a right lumbar, and we have a right inguinal region. So the right inguinal region is where we would find the appendix. We would find all down the right, we would find the ascending colon. And then we'd also have a left hypochondriac region, a left lumbar, and a left inguinal region. So we have covered a lot in this lecture, but we have also covered your learning objectives, and I'll go back to that and we can see your learning objectives. So you should now have more of an understanding of the components of the digestive system. So we talk about it having gone in a proximal to distal range. So proximal range would be, the proximal area would be the oral cavity all the way distally to the rectum. And we've looked at kind of the functions along the way. So we've looked at the functions of the major subdivisions. So that's the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestine. And we've briefly addressed the rectum, although you don't need a great deal of information on that. But we've also looked at some of the accessory organs. So we looked at the pancreas, the exocrine and endocrine properties of the pancreas. We looked at the liver and its bile production and the fact that it processes all of the minerals and the vitamins and the nutrients that we have absorbed from the small intestine. And we've had a brief look at the gallbladder and its role in storing that bile, which is going to neutralize the acid and emulsify the fats that we ingest. We have also looked at the peritoneal cavity, for which we were introduced to the idea of this potential space full of fluid, and how that peritoneal cavity kind of wraps around the abdominal organs. We also briefly looked at the omentum. So we looked at the lesser omentum, which is the one that runs from the liver to the stomach. And we looked at the greater omentum, which is the one that hangs like an apron off the bottom of the stomach. And then finally, we looked at the regions of the abdominal cavity. So we looked at the 9 regions, where we had the epigastric, the umbilical, and the hypogastric regions down the centre, and a left and a right version of the hypochondriac, the lumbar region, and the inguinal region. You have my contact details from this slide, so you can email me at t.n.chamberlain@leeds.ac.uk if you have any questions. And if you need to know anything else anatomy related, because I'm not very good at all the other stuff, but you can contact me there at any point. Thank you for persevering to the end. I hope you have enjoyed your brief little tour of the abdomen, and I look forward to meeting you over the course of the next couple of years, where I will hopefully be teaching you embryology and doing other recaps for your anatomy elements of the dentistry program. Speak to you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.